you're spending over $300 every spring replanting tomatoes, peppers, lettuce, beans, and cucumbers because that's what garden centers stock on their shelves. Meanwhile, indigenous growers across North America, Europe, and Asia built food systems around perennial vegetables that produce for 10 to 20 years, require almost zero maintenance after year two, and propagate themselves for free. Here are 17 perennial vegetables that permaculture designers and observation-based gardeners have relied on for decades to feed families without the replanting treadmill, the constant intervention, or the annual expense that keeps you funding garden centers instead of building a self-regulating food system. Most gardeners replant their entire vegetable garden every single year because that's what garden centers sell: tomatoes and peppers and beans and lettuce that die after one season. But here's the reality. That's a profit model, not a food system. Garden centers need you replanting every April because that's how they stay in business, which means the annual vegetable cycle isn't about what works best for your family, it's about what works best for their bottom line. Meanwhile, indigenous growers across North America built food security around perennial vegetables that produce for 10 to 20 years from a single planting, require almost zero maintenance after year two, and propagate themselves through division, self-seeding, and rhizome spread, which means you plant once and harvest for decades without buying another seedling. Think about it. Permaculture designers use these same crops to eliminate the replanting treadmill, reclaim 80% of gardening weekends, and build resilience that survives supply chain collapse and seed shortages. Here's what most people miss. Perennials aren't just asparagus and rhubarb. There are 17 perennial vegetables that cover every food category: greens and alliums and roots and shoots and herbs, and they work in small yards, containers, and even under HOA restrictions because they look ornamental while producing food. Perennial number one is asparagus, which most gardeners know but few understand the mechanism behind. You plant asparagus crowns once, and those deep root systems, which can reach 6 feet down into the soil, store energy over winter, and send up edible spears every spring for 15 to 20 years without replanting, reseeding, or even fertilizing if you mulch the bed with compost once a year. A single asparagus crown costs $3 to $5, produces 20 to 30 spears per year, starting in year 3, and keeps producing until 2045 if you plant it in 2025. Compare that to buying asparagus at the grocery store for $4 to $6 per pound every spring, and you're looking at $60 to $100 saved per year from just 5 crowns, which means over 15 years. That's $900 to $1,500 in food from a $25 investment and almost zero labor after the first season. Here's what nobody tells you. Asparagus roots aerate compacted soil as they grow, which means they're improving your garden bed while feeding you. And the ferny foliage that grows after harvest season drops nitrogen-rich organic matter that composts in place, building fertility without you hauling materials or turning piles. Perennial number 2 is rhubarb, and if you think it's just for pies, you're missing the bigger picture. Rhubarb is one of the most cold-hardy perennials on this list, surviving winters down to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, which means it works in climates where most vegetables need season extension and hoop houses. You plant one rhubarb crown, and it produces edible stalks for 20 to 30 years, sometimes longer, from a plant that requires nothing except occasional watering in year 1 and a shovelful of compost every other year. But here's the reality. The leaves are toxic, yes, but they make excellent mulch and pest deterrent around brassicas because slugs and aphids avoid them, which means rhubarb serves double duty as food and as a biological pest management tool in your garden system. Think about it. One rhubarb plant gives you 10 to 15 pounds of stalks per year, And while you can bake them into desserts, you can also stew them with savory dishes, make chutneys, or freeze them for year-round use, which means this one plant is feeding your family multiple ways for 3 decades from a single $5 crown. Perennial number 3 is globe artichoke. And this is where people start realizing perennials aren't just cold climate crops. Artichokes thrive in Mediterranean climates, tolerate drought once established, and produce edible flower buds for 10 to 15 years from a plant that doubles as a dramatic ornamental, which means HOA restricted gardeners can grow food that looks like landscaping. Each plant produces 5 to 10 artichoke heads per season, and the large silvery leaves act as living mulch, shading out weeds and dropping organic matter that composts in place, building soil while the plant is actively growing. Here's the mechanism. Artichokes are thistle relatives with deep taproots that mine nutrients from subsoil layers that shallow-rooted annuals never reach, which means they're feeding themselves from reserves your tomatoes can't access, and bringing those nutrients up into the topsoil as their leaves decompose. One artichoke plant costs $8 to $12, produces 50 to 100 artichokes over 10 years, and eliminates the need to weed or mulch a 4 square foot area because the plant does it for you. Now let's talk about perennials 4 and 5, horseradish and Jerusalem artichoke, also called sunchoke, because these are the aggressive spreaders that most gardeners either love or fear. Here's what most people miss. If you want exponential yield from minimal input, aggressive is exactly what you need. Horseradish is a root crop that you plant once, and it spreads through underground rhizomes, which means by year 3, you have more horseradish than you can harvest, and the roots you leave in the ground keep producing indefinitely. The leaves are edible when young, the roots are the classic condiment base, and the plant tolerates poor soil, full shade, and complete neglect, which means you can put it in the problem corner of your yard where nothing else grows, and it will thrive for 20 years without you doing anything. Jerusalem artichoke works the same way. You plant one tuber, and it sends up 6-foot-tall stalks that produce edible tubers underground, and those tubers multiply every year, which means you plant 5 pounds of sunchokes in year 1 and harvest 50 pounds in year 3 and 100 pounds in year 5 if you let them spread. Here's the mechanism nobody tells you. Sunchokes grow in terrible soil, clay or sand or compacted hardpan, and they actually improve that soil as they grow because their roots break up compacted layers and their stalks drop tons of organic matter every fall when they die back. The caution with both horseradish and sunchokes is containment. If you don't want them taking over your entire garden, plant them in a dedicated bed with barriers or in large containers. But if you have space and you want a crop that produces 5 to 10 times more food every year with zero input, these are your plants. Now let's talk about perennials that most people assume require replanting every year because garden centers have conditioned us to think onions, greens, and herbs are always annuals. But here's the reality. There are perennial versions of almost every crop category, and they outperform annuals in yield per square foot once they're established, which means you're gardening backwards if you're still buying onion sets and lettuce transplants every spring. Perennial number 6 is walking onions, also called Egyptian onions or tree onions. And the name tells you exactly how they work. Instead of producing seeds, they grow small bulbs at the top of their stalks, and those top bulbs get heavy, bend the stalk down to the ground, plant themselves, and start a new clump, which means they literally walk across your garden bed over the course of 5 to 10 years without you doing anything. You plant one cluster of walking onion bulbs, and within 3 years, you have 20 clusters spreading across a 4-foot by 4-foot area, giving you fresh onion greens from March through November and edible bulbs year-round. The top bulbs are small, about the size of shallots, but they're intensely flavored, and the hollow green shoots taste like scallions, which means you're getting two crops, greens and bulbs, from one plant that never needs replanting and propagates itself for free. Here's what nobody tells you. Walking onions are one of the most cold-hardy alliums, surviving temperatures down to -30 degrees Fahrenheit, and they grow in partial shade, poor soil, and containers, which means you can put them in problem areas where lettuce would bolt and tomatoes would fail. Perennial number 7 is sorrel, and this is the perennial green that replaces spinach and salad lettuce for 7 to 10 years from a single planting. Sorrel has a lemony, tangy flavor because of the oxalic acid in the leaves, and you harvest it using the cut and come again method, which means you take the outer leaves and let the center keep producing, giving you 4 to 6 harvests per season from each plant. Think about it. One sorrel plant costs $3 to $4, grows in sun or partial shade, tolerates clay soil and neglect, and produces enough greens to feed 2 people per week for 7 years, which means you're looking at over 200 salads from one plant that requires 0 replanting, 0 fertilizing if you mulch it once a year, and maybe 10 minutes of harvesting time per month. Meanwhile, grocery store salad greens cost $4 to $6 per pound. You're buying them weekly, and they're shipped from California in plastic containers that generate waste. Or you can plant 5 sorrel plants for $20 and harvest fresh greens from your backyard for the next decade. Here's where it gets interesting. Sorrel also works beautifully under fruit trees as part of a perennial guild because it tolerates the dappled shade. Its deep taproot doesn't compete with shallow tree roots, and it attracts beneficial insects while acting as a living mulch that suppresses weeds. Perennial number 8 is Good King Henry, and if you've never heard of it, that's because it's a European indigenous crop that never became popular in American garden centers, but permaculture designers use it as a spinach substitute that produces for 8 to 10 years with almost 0 maintenance. The leaves taste like mild spinach. The young shoots can be cooked like asparagus, and the flower buds are edible, which means you're getting 3 different vegetables from one plant. Good King Henry grows in partial shade, tolerates poor soil, and self-seeds gently without becoming invasive, which means you plant 5 plants in year 1, and by year 3, you have 12 plants from natural reseeding that you can transplant to other areas or give to neighbors. Here's the mechanism. Good King Henry is in the same family as quinoa and amaranth, which means it's drought tolerant once established, and its leaves are high in iron, calcium, and vitamins A and C, making it more nutrient dense than most annual greens. Perennial number 9 is lovage, and most gardeners think of it as an herb, but it's really a perennial celery substitute that grows 6 feet tall, produces prolifically for 10 to 15 years, and feeds a family of 4 from a single plant. The leaves, stems, seeds, and roots are all edible, tasting like intense celery with a hint of anise, and you can use them fresh in salads, cooked in soups and stews, or dried for winter seasoning. One lovage plant costs $5 to $8, grows in full sun or partial shade, and produces enough foliage for weekly harvests from April through October for over a decade, which means you're replacing grocery store celery, which costs $3 to $4 per bunch and is mostly water weight, with a plant that gives you concentrated flavor and nutrition without replanting. But here's what most people miss. Lovage is a companion planting powerhouse because it attracts parasitic wasps, hoverflies, and ground beetles that prey on aphids, caterpillars, and other garden pests, which means planting lovage at the back of your perennial bed creates a biological pest control system that protects everything in front of it. Perennial number 10 is chives, And while most gardeners know chives, they don't realize that chives are a true perennial that spreads through division, never needs replanting, and produces edible leaves and flowers for 15 to 20 years from a single clump. Chives taste like mild garlic onion. The purple flowers are edible and attract pollinators, and the plant forms dense clumps that suppress weeds and act as a living border around garden beds. You plant one pot of chives for $3 to $5, and by year 3, you can divide that clump into 10 separate plants, which means you're propagating for free and expanding your perennial system without buying anything. Here's the companion planting benefit that changes everything. Chives repel aphids, Japanese beetles, and carrot rust flies through their sulfur compounds, which means planting chives as a border around your vegetable beds creates a protective barrier that reduces pest pressure on everything inside. Chives also thrive in containers, which means renters and apartment gardeners can grow them on balconies in 5-gallon buckets and bring them indoors for winter harvests under grow lights. Now let's talk about perennial number 11, sea kale, because this is where it gets interesting with crops most people have never heard of, but that European gardeners have grown for centuries. Sea kale is a coastal perennial that produces edible shoots, leaves, and flowers, tolerates salt spray and sandy soil, and keeps producing for 15 to 20 years once established. The young shoots are blanched under pots or mulch in early spring, which makes them tender and mild-flavored like asparagus, and the leaves can be cooked like collard greens later in the season. Sea kale requires almost no maintenance after the first year, spreads slowly through root division, and looks ornamental enough for front yard landscaping with its blue-green foliage and white flower clusters. Here's the reality. Sea kale is one of the most drought-tolerant perennials on this list because it evolved on coastal cliffs where water drains fast and soil is poor, which means if you're gardening in a dry climate or dealing with sandy soil where annuals struggle, sea kale thrives without irrigation once its roots established. Perennial number 12 is Turkish rocket, and this is a true perennial green that self-seeds but stays controlled, tastes like spicy arugula, and produces continuous harvests for 5 to 7 years from a single planting. The leaves are edible raw in salads or cooked like spinach. The flowers are edible and attract pollinators, and the plant tolerates partial shade and poor soil, which means you can tuck it into spots where annual greens would bolt or fail. Turkish rocket grows 2 to 3 feet tall, and once it's established, it self-seeds gently at the base, giving you new plants every year without becoming invasive like some self-seeders, which means you're getting natural propagation without the takeover problem. Here's what most people miss. Turkish rocket is one of the few perennial greens that actually prefers cool weather and partial shade, which means you can grow it under deciduous trees where it gets spring and fall sun, but summer shade, creating a productive use for space that would otherwise sit empty. Perennial number 13 is Caucasian spinach, also called Hablitzia, and it's a climbing perennial that produces spinach-flavored leaves for 10 to 15 years and grows up trellises or fences, which means you're using vertical space instead of ground space. The young shoots taste like asparagus. The mature leaves taste like spinach, and the plant climbs 8 to 10 feet tall, which means one plant can produce several pounds of greens per season from just 1 square foot of ground area. Caucasian spinach is shade tolerant, cold hardy down to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and requires almost no maintenance once the root system establishes, which means you plant it once on the north side of a fence or under a tree canopy and harvest greens for a decade. Now let's talk about perennial number 14, groundnut, also called Apios americana, because This is a Native American staple crop that most modern gardeners have never heard of, but that indigenous growers relied on for centuries as a high-protein perennial. Groundnut is a nitrogen-fixing vine that climbs trellises, produces edible tubers underground, and keeps producing for 10 to 15 years from a single planting. The tubers taste like a cross between potatoes and peanuts, contain about 16% protein, which is higher than potatoes at 2%, and store for months in a cool, dry place. Here's the mechanism that changes everything. Groundnut has nitrogen-fixing nodules on its roots like beans, which means it's improving your soil while producing food, and the vine itself can climb up corn stalks or pole beans in a Three Sisters style polyculture, which means you're stacking functions in the same space. One groundnut tuber costs $5 to $8, produces 10 to 20 tubers by year 3, and those tubers can be divided and replanted to expand your bed for free, which means you're building exponential food production from a minimal initial investment. Perennial number 15 is ostrich fern. And while most people think of ferns as ornamental, the young spring shoots, called fiddleheads, are a prized edible that sells for $10 to $12 per pound at farmers markets. And you can harvest them from your own yard for 15 to 20 years from a single planting. Fiddleheads taste like a cross between asparagus and green beans, are rich in omega-3 fatty acids and antioxidants, and appear in early spring when almost nothing else is producing, which means they fill a gap in the perennial harvest calendar. Ostrich ferns spread through underground rhizomes, tolerate full shade, and grow in moist soil where most vegetables would rot, which means you can plant them in low spots, along stream banks, or under dense tree canopy and turn problem areas into productive food zones. Here's the caution. You harvest fiddleheads only in early spring when the shoots are tightly coiled, and you leave at least half the shoots unharvested so the fern can photosynthesize and store energy for next year, which means this is a once-a-year crop, but it's a high-value crop that requires zero maintenance and produces in spaces where nothing else will. Perennial number 16 is daylily, and most gardeners grow daylilies as ornamentals without realizing that the flowers, tubers, and young shoots are all edible and have been used in Asian cuisines for thousands of years. The flower buds can be stir-fried or added to soups. The open flowers are sweet and crunchy in salads, and the tubers taste like a mild radish or water chestnut. One day-lily plant produces 20 to 30 edible flowers per season, spreads through tuber division, and thrives in terrible soil, full sun or partial shade, clay or sand, drought or occasional flooding, which means it's one of the most adaptable perennials on this list. Here's the dual-purpose benefit. Daylilies look ornamental enough for HOA, restricted front yards, which means you're growing food that passes as landscaping, and they're so low maintenance that you can plant them once and ignore them for a decade while they keep producing. By year 3, each daylily clump can be divided into 5 to 10 new plants, which means you're propagating for free and expanding your edible landscape without spending another dollar. Perennial number 17 is ramps, also called wild leeks, and while they're slow to establish, taking 3 to 5 years to reach full production, they're one of the most valuable perennial alliums because they sell for $15 to $20 per pound and grow in full shade under deciduous trees where almost no other food crop will produce. Ramps taste like a combination of garlic, onions, and leeks, and both the leaves and bulbs are edible, appearing in early spring before the tree canopy leafs out. Here's the mechanism. Ramps spread through seeds and bulb division, and once you establish a ramp patch, it will naturalize and expand slowly for decades, giving you an annual spring harvest that requires zero maintenance and fills the early season gap when your garden is just waking up. The key is patience. You plant ramp bulbs or seeds, wait 3 to 5 years for them to establish, and then harvest sustainably by taking only one leaf per plant or a small percentage of bulbs each year, which allows the patch to keep expanding. When you transition to a perennial vegetable system, these 17 crops cover your complete food needs. Greens from sorrel, Turkish rocket, Caucasian spinach, and Good King Henry. Alliums from walking onions, chives and ramps. Roots from sunchokes, horseradish, and groundnut. Shoots from asparagus and fiddleheads, and even flowers and herbs from daylily, lovage, and sea kale. Which means you're not giving up diversity or nutrition by switching to perennials. Here's the implementation strategy that actually works for time-poor homeowners. Start with 3 to 5 perennials this spring. The easy ones like asparagus, rhubarb, walking onions, sorrel, and chives, which cost $50 to $70 total and require minimal care in year 1. Then add 3 to 4 more perennials each following spring, layering in lovage, sunchokes, daylilies, and Turkish rocket in year 2, and groundnut, sea kale, and fiddleheads in year 3, which means by year 3, you have 12 to 15 perennial crops producing, and by year 5, you have a fully mature system that feeds your family with almost zero intervention. Think about it. The financial transformation is undeniable. Most families spend $250 to $400 every spring on annual vegetable seedlings, transplants, seeds, fertilizers, and pest controls, which means over 20 years. That's $5,000 to $8,000 spent on inputs that you have to buy again and again. Or you invest $150 to $200 once on perennial crowns, roots, and plants. And those crops produce for 2 decades without replanting, which means you're saving $4,800 to $7,800 over the life of your garden while reclaiming 80% of the time you currently spend on planting, weeding, watering, and pest management. But here's the reality that matters more than money. Supply chains collapse, seed companies consolidate, food prices spike, and droughts or floods wipe out annual crops. But asparagus planted in 2025 doesn't care about any of that because it's still producing in 2045. And sunchokes keep multiplying. And walking onions keep spreading. And your family keeps eating regardless of what's happening at grocery stores or garden centers. This is observation-based design applied to modern food insecurity. You're not trying to control or dominate your garden with constant inputs and interventions. You're partnering with plants that evolved to regenerate, spread, and produce without your help, which means you're building resilience through biological systems instead of buying your way out of problems you created through poor design. Garden centers profit from the annual replanting cycle because tomatoes and peppers and lettuce die every year, which means you're back in April buying the same crops you bought last April, funding a business model that depends on your dependency. Perennials break that loop. Start this spring, not next year, because every season you delay is another $300 spent on annuals and another year until your perennial system matures and starts propagating itself. Plant once. Harvest for 20 years.